Ukraine, they can attack at any time. They can have an impact at any time in this war. They're not going to move territorial lines, but their hits are going to have psychological hits in the Russia, Putin, and in the community, putting more pressure. And then the economic stuff is just going to completely squeeze President Putin. Now would be the right time for the president to shake things up and put these secondary sanctions in. I think it's, if you're negotiating and you're looking for leverage, this gives you more leverage at this point.
Hi, I'm Maddie, Hale, and welcome to the Trump Report. Today we've had Bryan Lanza on the show. He's a former communications director for Trump. He's also a former senior advisor. We have him on to talk about what he thinks Trump's reaction would have been to Ukraine's drone strikes. Would he be proud of Ukraine? The fact that Donald Trump hasn't responded. We also speak to him about this bill that Lindsey Graham's put forward to place 500% tariffs on countries that are importing Russian energy. So whether Trump's going to go forward with that. So all that today on the Trump Report. You can watch us every day, Monday through Friday on Times Radio's YouTube. Bryan Lanza, former communications director and former advisor to Donald Trump. Thank you so much for joining the Trump Report today.
Great. Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
I want to get straight into what's happened on Sunday night. Of course, Ukraine launched a drone strike into Russia. They destroyed about 1/3 of Russia's strategic missile carriers. It's been hailed as a massive success for Ukraine. But a message that's also been kind of taken away from it was that it was Ukraine's way of telling the United States, telling Donald Trump that no, they're not losing this war the way that Putin may have described to Trump, may have described to the rest of the world. And we know that Donald Trump hasn't publicly come out and spoken about this attack, but how do you think Trump would react to this behind closed doors?
Listen, I think he'd be impressed. I mean, you have to understand, I mean, Russia is a nuclear power, and Ukraine is certainly, David against Goliath. And what you saw this past weekend was Goliath getting hit in the face, and it's going to have an impact. It's these things shouldn't happen to Russia, right? It's a far superior military force. They've always done a good job of protecting things internal of the border, so it's a huge success on the Ukraine side. I think for President Trump, for him, it's just further, is this another step so we can get toward a ceasefire? And if it's yes, that's great. Obviously, there's been strategic changes as a result of the attack that took place in Russia because of the morale success that the Ukrainians had, because of the operational success they've had and the propaganda success they've had. And Russia's sort of trying to figure out what to do next. And you see Ukraine continuing to punch. I think at some point, it's in Putin's best interest, I suspect, to find a resolution and to utilize Trump to bring a resolution forward. I think everybody's ready. We're just waiting on Russia at this point.
We know that this was an 18-month operation, Bryan, from Ukraine. They kind of kept it behind closed doors. They kept it under wraps as they planned this massive drone strikes, and they didn't tell Donald Trump about it. They didn't let any of their allies know about what they were planning. Do you think Trump would care that he wasn't given privy to this information, or do you think that maybe Ukraine thought perhaps he would try and tell them not to do it?
No, listen, I think even Donald Trump wouldn't show all of his cards to just anybody. So I think he, from a CEO standpoint, he looks at what the Ukrainians did and what Zelensky did, President Zelensky, under a positive lens. A, they kept a secret, which, Trump hates leaks, so that's impressive on that standpoint. And B, they're able to execute it. I think those are things that President Trump is going to look at and say, is momentum shifting as a result of these attacks? And we'll see.
Do you think this attack from Ukraine was a signal that they were thinking to Trump, look, we're going to win this war with or without further help from the United States, further help from any allies. We're not going to wait around anymore for these negotiations to have a result.
Yeah, listen, I don't think Ukraine sees them to the point that they're certainly going to win this war. I mean, they had a huge success, but it took 18 months. If we have to wait another 18 months, you're going to see a huge impact on the ground. I think the message that President Trump's going to deliver to Putin, President Putin, as a result of this, is like, you can't sustain more of these things, and you can no longer predict them. So you either elevate it to a level that the world is not ready for, and you're not ready for, which is nuclear war, or you find an off-ramp and let me be that off-ramp. I think President Trump's probably the best person to deliver this message to President Putin because he knows how high the stakes are.
Yesterday, we saw these peace negotiations continue in Istanbul, Brian. We saw, of course, Keith Kellogg. He was there representing the United States, but as many experts would predict, no real resolution came out of them other than a prisoner swap and anyone who's been abducted under the age of 25. But what we know is that Russia has continued to make these concession demands from Ukraine that they're, of course, never going to sign off on. And the United States, of course, also didn't sign off on it. But what do you think Donald Trump's next steps are as someone who's heavily involved in these negotiations, or the United States is heavily involved? Because we know that Trump made this 2-week hard deadline to Putin. He said, look, if you don't prove to me that you want peace within 2 weeks, I'm going to act very differently. So what do you think Trump's next steps will be?
It'll be economic. It'll be sanctions. It'll be secondary sanctions. So it'll be anybody who does business with Russia, will suffer secondary sanctions. And the two primary countries are China and India. And these countries have to make a decision. We're not here to bully them. Europe's not here to bully China. The U.S. is not here to bully India. But we're pretty clear with what the message would be if President Trump goes forward. That enough is enough. This war needs to come to an end. You can't continue to fund the Russian war machine and expect to be treated, as though nothing has happened in the international community. It's just enough is enough.
And we know that Trump's been threatening these economic sanctions, Brian, but I think people have been wondering, the waiting game is over, the threats are over, let's actually put this into motion now. And we've seen this through this sanctions bill, that a bipartisan sanctions bill that Lindsey Graham, Democratic Richard Blumenthal have introduced. Donald Trump has yet to endorse it, but basically what it would mean is that it would be a 500% tariff on any country that buys Moscow's energy products. And as you mentioned, that would mostly affect China and India. These two came home from Ukraine and basically said all the evidence that they found in Ukraine was that Putin was gearing up for a summer of a lot more offensive. He was ready to continue this war. But as I said, Trump, he hasn't said whether he endorses it, although we do know that he endorses the idea of sanctions, but not particularly this bill. But this seems to be the card that the president should now put forward. Do you think it's time for him to do so?
Well, first of all, to speak to the bill that Lindsey Graham is pushing, it's not a good bill. I mean, the authority of foreign policy is the President of the United States. It's not Congress. And Congress is now putting themselves in direct path of foreign policy, and to me it seems unconstitutional. It's veto proof, but I'm sure as it gets litigated, as it ultimately will be litigated in the courts, it'll be found unconstitutional. Because Congress should have no say in the sanctions game. That is a foreign policy that President Trump is using, and our Constitution is abundantly clear who handles foreign policy. As for respect for President Trump, I think he's kept all his options open. He's given Putin a deadline, and we're coming near on that deadline. And this would be the next step. So you have the Ukrainian assault that just took place, which hurt a third of Russia's nuclear bombers. Right? You have that was a success, but the psychological success from that is that it could happen at any time and anywhere in Russia. So that's a huge cycle. Putin's not going to know where it's going to happen next, and he's going to be more paranoid. And then you come with the threat of stronger economic sanctions. Now Putin's in a pinch. He cannot rebuild he cannot continue to fund this war if China and India are not supplying the resources. So Ukraine, they can attack at any time. They can have an impact at any time in this war. They're not going to move territorial lines, but their hits are going to have psychological hits in the Russia, Putin, and in the community, putting more pressure. And then the economic stuff is just going to completely squeeze President Putin. Now would be the right time for the president to shake things up and put these secondary sanctions in. I think if you're negotiating and you're looking for leverage, this gives you more leverage at this point.
You said that this was kind of unconstitutional, Brian, for this bill to go through Congress. But do you see Donald Trump kind of taking the idea of the bill, the 500% tariffs on these countries importing energy, and just kind of putting through an executive order instead?
I mean, as he always does, right? It's not executive order. I mean, he has the ability to sanction anybody at any time. And the process in the United States is as much as President Trump signing one document, it's Treasury doing it. 500 is that's a shocking number to garner media attention. But the reality is once you get to what is it? I think 125% tariff, it makes no mathematical sense to go forward anyway. So the difference between 125 and 500 is zero impact because you've already hit maximum impact with 125 tariffs. But it gets headlines, right? That's my point. This bill is about headlines, and it's not about actually giving the president, the one who handles the foreign policies. They're interjecting themselves for headlines. That should never be rewarded.
Well, when you've got Lindsey Graham, he's coming out publicly. Of course, he's a very staunch Ukraine supporter, but he's also been an ally of Donald Trump's. He's come out and said that Trump's strategy for being friendly and enticing with Vladimir Putin has become, he said it's become painfully clear that he's not interested in ending this war. I wonder if it shows that some Republicans are telling Trump that it's time to change strategies. It's time to stop being nice to Putin. He's clearly not wanting to end the war. He's clearly tapping you along, in Trump's words.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I think the difference is what's the reaction, right? What does Lindsey want and what did President Trump want? We do not, the United States, want a military engagement with Russia. Doesn't end well for the world. We know, we've seen the models, we've seen the movies, we've read the books. I've seen Tom Clancy's, novels about nuclear war, and so we know what that looks like, right? Lindsey's the type of person, coming from the military-industrial complex. He's willing to risk it. That's just who he's always been. He's the one who still has not answered his questions for the United States going to war with Iraq. Remember, he was the one who told us there were weapons of mass destruction. We had to act now. That turned out to be an epic failure. So, listen, I know Lindsey's role in government. It's always been the same role, and that is to carry the tip of the spear for the military-industrial complex, and that's fine. But President Trump is not that person that just buys those answers because somebody says this took place. Lindsey has very limited credibility when he says a country's preparing themselves for more war, because I still remember what he said during Iraq.
What do you think on that note then, Brian? We say that we know the movies, we know the books, we know how Putin wants to play this game. He wants the Soviet Union back. That's the entire reason why he started this war. So why do you think Donald Trump has said before that he doesn't think Putin wants war? He doesn't think Putin wants to take more countries other than Ukraine?
Because his military has been decimated, and that's even before this weekend's attack.
So you think that he means that Russia actually just doesn't have the capabilities to do that?
100%. Yeah, they don't have the capability anymore. Listen, there was the illusion of that capability before the start of the Ukraine-Russia war, I think, but the illusion has now disappeared as we've seen, Ukraine, a small military country, really no offensive weapons, not only maintain but create these attacks. Like, Russia is not this scary army that it once, was during the Soviet, empire, right? It is a severely degraded military. It was even more degraded over this past weekend. Ukraine is showing it has the ability to even degrade it even further, no matter what actions they're going to take, because Ukraine's going to learn, Russia's going to learn. But at the end of the day, creative people always find a way to make things work. And do you? I mean, if you're Putin, do you really think you can convince your electorate to go after NATO, especially when you couldn't even deal with Ukraine? Seems like a hard sell to me.
So you think it's now clear to Donald Trump and the US administration that Ukraine is winning this fight? They're in the midst of it.
They're winning the psychological part of it, sure. I mean, they're not gaining territory, which is ultimately how you measure who's winning and losing a war. But the last couple of days, they've had they're certainly winning the psychological war right now. Because if you're Putin, if you're the leadership in Russia, even if you're a Russian citizen, to know that you can be struck at any time, that's a psychological impact.
I wonder how his mindset would have changed in the last 48 hours. Do you think that he is going into a more of a, preparing for something to be done closer? He's preparing for an attack on Ukraine a little bit sooner than we thought.
Yeah, listen, I by no measurement are going to try to claim that I can read President Putin's mind or sort of predict these pieces, right? Yeah, yeah, but human nature is human nature, right? You've just been punched in the face. The whole playground saw. So what's the reaction, right? You almost have to come back with a stronger assault. Does that mean he pushes forward with his summer offensive that people have been anticipating for a year now? Probably, but I think we've now seen, we've seen for the last 6 months, they need to be gaining miles every day, for this war to be a success. They're gaining feet. And at this point, you can sort of do the math. Putin runs out of bodies pretty. Is the price worth it? Because it's an expensive price of military equipment that gets destroyed that could potentially not be rebuilt, of human resources that get killed or maimed that cannot be brought back in. Is all that worth small territorial gains? I think it gets harder and harder. And Ukraine is, as of the last 48 hours, they are winning the psychological war. We will see what Russia's response is. Does it go, but we'll see. I mean, it's when the bully gets punched in the face, there's he either gets more aggressive or he extends his hand. Let's hope he extends his hand.
Brian, just a final question. There's obviously been so much concern that Donald Trump will lose patience in a negotiation when it comes to ending this war. If he steps out of negotiations just from a point of mediation, there's not so much more concern, but there is more concern when it comes to whether he would revoke military aid, whether he'd revoke intelligence. Do you see that happening?
Listen, I think the big question becomes, if President Trump is frustrated and wants to walk away, if he puts sanctions in as he walks away. If he puts sanctions in as he walks away, you'll most likely see a resolution, within a month, right? Because Russia just is, the tremendous amount of pressure that China and India would put on Russia to concluding this because of the vast economic impact it's having, is none of us can imagine that impact right now. First of all, let's be clear about that. So if Trump were to walk away while leaving sanctions, we'd have a resolution pretty fast. If Trump were to remain while leaving sanctions, we'd have a resolution pretty fast. I think, we're 6 months into this, or Trump's presidency. He's clearly giving the hard deadlines. I would tell Putin to read the signals.
Well, we're waiting to watch that, Brian. We hope within the next few days Trump will announce those sanctions. So, Bryan Lanza, thank you so much for joining the Trump Report today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Have a great week.